Kia ora tātou, nau mai ki tēnei hui mō te herenga reportia nā take panoni ahuarangi. Thanks for logging into this Q&A session, everyone, on reporting on climate change risk. Just a reminder, this is a Q&A session, so we haven't asked the panelists to prepare presentations. They're just here to answer questions. So the purpose of this session is to follow up on our earlier explainer session, although it's not crucial that you have attended or you've seen that earlier session. But if you haven't seen it and you'd like to, then you'll find the link to it in the invitation, and you can also email me and I'll send you the link. So in this Q&A session, we'll answer some of the questions that people emailed to us or asked at registration. And we'll also answer as many live questions as we can from people in the room. If you see a question come up, if you like that question from an attendee, you can also vote on it for it to be answered by a panel. And if any of the questions need clarification, if you're happy for us to bring you live into the room, then can you let us know by typing in live and then a colon and then your question when you're typing in the question so that we know. We're not going to get to everyone's questions, so apologies in advance. You'll see that you were asked 2 questions when you entered the room. We're going to ask you a couple of questions every 10 minutes throughout the session, and I'll pause when the questions come up for a couple of seconds to give you a chance to respond. And you'll see the results as the people in the room respond, and we'll also publish those results following the session. But the poll is anonymous, so no personal information is going to be collected. Okay, we're going to start off with one of the questions that was emailed into us. Donovan.
Great, thanks, and good morning, everyone. So the first question, I think, is an understandable one. There are a few people that asked that. It was, what level of detail do you think will be required with the disclosure?
So what level of detail was required in the disclosure?
That's right, there, yes. Okay. Yes, sorry about that.
Ultimately, the level of detail, it should be appropriate to meet the needs of the minister or the commission, who is ever making the request for information. But I expect that further guidance will be provided on this, and that the disclosures will become more sophisticated and comprehensive over time. But bear in mind that the information is being used to inform the National Adaptation Plan. For now, I would assume that given the risks identified in the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, the information a reporting entity will be expected to disclose will relate to those risks identified in the risk assessment. And as that risk assessment develops and includes, not just the physical risk, but also the transition risks, then I'd imagine that reporting entities will be expected to report on those additional risks. But there's 2 things to bear in mind, and the first is organisations must identify and understand their climate-related risks, just as they identify and they understand any other risks. And if nothing else, climate change creates a financial risk, so it should already be being assessed and being dealt with as such by the CFO and the risk team. So this information should already be on the books, and if it's being dealt with responsibly, then reporting on it, it shouldn't be particularly onerous. This is not a new risk. Climate risk has, we know it's existed for decades, and this is simply a new requirement to disclose how that risk is being managed. So it should already be being managed, and if it's not, then it's really, this disclosure requirement is really a prompt for organisations to start managing it. And I think for now, there's some leniency around how it's being managed, but I can guarantee that, your insurers and your financiers are going to start requiring increased rigor and fairly rapidly, and public funders are going to do the same.
Thanks, Mark. And a follow-up question that was linked to this one was around the justification of the information in that disclosure. So a couple of people asked the question, will they have to justify any statements or provide links to reports as a way of backing up?
Well, this really goes to the question of assurance. There's no formal independent external assurance process in place at the moment. but disclosures should be subject to internal governance processes, and this is something you know a lot about, Donovan. And any assumptions should be supportable. They should be traceable back to their sources. So I'd say it's prudent to cross-reference and to map to sources. And there's also going to be this informal assurance process where stakeholders can compare, or they can consider disclosures by counterparties, etc. And this will flush out any failings or shortcomings in disclosure of the organisation. So I see this as really quite a significant legal risk for organisations that don't make full and accurate disclosure. But you've had some experience in this from your work in Australia, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. And at the end of the day, if you're making any disclosure, if you've made an answer, it's come from some source anyway. So it's having access to that source is, I think, critical. Ian, have you experienced that in your work around TCFD?
Oh, look, if I put my accounting hat on, I think it comes down to the balance of ensuring that you're providing enough information to enable stakeholders to actually make reasonable decisions based on the information you're providing. And like everything, I think as we work our way through this, it's going to be contextual and it's going to be specific to the example at hand. But yeah, that's something that's a judgment call. But as Mark says, if you don't get it right, and perhaps if you don't err on the side of caution, for example, there are potential legal ramifications.
Thanks,
in the session we had, a couple of weeks ago, I went through a list of all those criteria that you need to be aware of when you're making this disclosure. And that's for the organisation itself, to sort of check through that list and make sure that it's making disclosure correctly in order to mitigate or avoid some of that legal risk. But, as I say, over time, more and more of this information is going to be disclosed by organisations. And it's going to create, this will be like that jigsaw puzzle, it's going to start filling in those pieces. So, stakeholders, investors, or, people in the community business and that, they're going to start understanding the level of risk that the organisations face, whether you're a local authority or whatever. They're going to start piecing that together. And if they recognise that the organisation is not managing that risk, and then that will raise concerns, and it may lead to further action from it. So really, the point is that as an organisation, understand your risk, and as we said last time, disclose it honestly and as fully as possible, and continue to increase in doing that. But also be aware this information does feed into a national adaptation plan, and that national adaptation plan should benefit, those authorities or those relevant organisations. And if you're not disclosing information and passing it into that adaptation plan, then you're really limiting the ability for you to benefit from the outcomes of that national adaptation plan.
And actually, if I can throw something else in there, just putting the TCFD hat on, if you look at the strategic element of the TCFD, which is all about providing information about how your entity's strategy copes or deals with climate change. One of the main tools that's applied there, or is proposed to be applied, is actually scenario analysis. Now, scenario analysis, like many things in this space, to undertake that analysis requires consideration of possible future states, of which there are infinite numbers. So to enable people to actually interpret what they're looking at there, it's going to be critical and important to incorporate how those scenarios are developed, assumptions that have been applied, that sort of information. Not only the statement or the finding itself, but how you came to that conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's critical. I'm just going to ask a couple more questions, and then
sorry, Donovan, can I just add something on to that?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, and Ian, you've raised a really important point there, and it's fundamental to disclosure, is that this information has to be not only consistent, but it has to be comparable. And in order for it to be comparable, we have to understand where those assumptions have come from, which is why it's so important. As you say, there's a whole range of scenarios you can adopt or you can apply, but in some ways they're not meaningful unless you have that, unless you trace back to those sources for those assumptions.
Well, and then, I mean, I'll add to that as well. Then the important, it brings up the importance of a climate change policy or a corporate standard to guide an organisation about what is that agreed, consistent, and robust source of information that councils will be, or Lifeline Utilities will be drawing on. And in Australia, we're seeing that emerge a lot now, because large organisations, of course, sometimes operate in silos, and they don't know, there's so much climate change information out there, and they don't quite know which pocket of information they should be grabbing. And so I think that comes back to that critical importance of having a policy, which then it tells you, this is the information, when you're justifying it, this is why we chose this information to fall back on, because it's in our policy.
And just on that point, we talked last time, we talked about a policy, but in reality, there's a whole range of policies that you need to, that organisations need to consider, a whole lot of elements to policies that need to be considered. One is, and I know that you've been working with local governments in Australia on this sort of an overarching policy that sets out, a sort of a bit of a game plan anyway, like what are the rules of engagement that you're dealing with under the policy. Whereas you can, then you'll need sort of other policies forming around climate change about how you manage your information and who's involved in decision making.
Which in itself, by the way, forms an important part of disclosure, right? When you're looking at the governance layer, being able to show that you actually have adopted these corporate governance mechanisms. And certainly I would imagine that more and more organisations are going to be looking for that. And actually, if you look at the way that the TCFD has evolved over time, that's sort of where it started. It's all about getting those, those governance layers and mechanisms in place that enable all of these other tools and processes to then evolve.
And so I think actually to respond to that, Ian, that statement, I think we need to come to this question that Chris Cameron's put up there on the box, because I think it's actually quite critical. So Chris asked the questions. I think the main issue, at least for councils, is quantifying the risks they face. Wouldn't you agree? And in an essence, for me, I say it's absolutely fundamental. You need to understand what it is you need to adapt to, of course. But I think that the first step that's really critical is to get your governance right. So your systems in place. So when you identify the risks, you already know, the types of responses and the mechanism for those responses. Wouldn't you guys agree?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I'd be very careful about the word quantify too. I mean, when you're dealing with something as, pervasive and ultimately as uncertain around climate change. We all know the directions it's heading. What we don't know is when it's going to happen, how differing risks are going to cascade and compound, and what that might mean for an organisation. It may not be possible to quantify it. It may be more about, qualifying the fact that it exists, and these are the things, or these are the things we are doing in our organisation to reduce our exposure to that risk and to build our resilience around it. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I've actually seen some organisations, what they have been doing is quantifying the actual responses. So they might say, look, we've got 4 planned retreat options. We're doing 3 different pockets of research. They're grouping them by typology, so they're quantifying that in a way once they start getting a relatively large shopping list. It depends on the size of your organisation. But I think you made a really good point there.
Yeah, and I agree that I know there's another survey question popped up, but maybe we'll just keep talking and sort of phase it in out as they're answering that. But I agree, like the different risks, it may be easier in some ways to quantify risks associated with those physical impacts, and less easy to do that with some of those transition risks. And when I look at the legal risks associated with climate change, you have to really approach them differently than you would other risks. I mean, when we look at risk in terms of law, like we have a fairly different approach to way risk is sort of understood and assessed in other ways. So it's not a one size fits all.
That's actually a really good point when you're talking about the legal risk, because for me, it brings up the example of the Victorian bushfires and how the failure of the governance structures around their maintenance regimes and to justify how they were doing their decision making actually led to some of the litigation. And the litigation was huge. I mean, the out of court settlement for the litigation for the state agencies was about $500 million. I think the litigation itself the class action was about $4 billion, but it was kind of sitting on the challenges associated with the governance or lack of governance around that.
We had this conversation yesterday. One of the big problems around law, and this was highlighted into the inquiries of the bushfires in Australia, was that there's a lot of grey areas. There are some really old laws, from early on in the previous century, and modern laws, and for different areas, and they don't always fit seamlessly together. And one of the big issues around emergency management in Australia that's arisen is that there are some grey areas where it's difficult to understand who actually should be responding or acting in certain ways, and there's some overlaps. So the law's not perfect, and it's not easy sometimes just to go through the legislation and say, look at Section 5ZW, and that tells me I can take into account climate change. Like there's much more to it than that. Unfortunately, that just adds another layer of complexity
there. So Mark, when you're saying, who was responsible, you're talking both within the organisation, but also that multi-level governance or differing sort of stakeholders. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, probably both. When I was talking about the bushfires, what I actually had in mind was the first responders. Like there were concerns about the role of the fire, emergency services, and fire and police. And there was a specific example, sort of diverting, but powers to remove people forcibly from an area that's at risk. And in some agencies didn't have power, and some did. So it had confusion. In terms of climate change, when the risk, again, it's different decision makers have different obligations, either under regulation or within the organisations themselves. So again, it's not straightforward. But it comes back to that point. Governance is it's not everything, but it's 99% of understanding and managing risk when it comes to climate change. And those need to set out who those decision makers are and what their responsibilities are.
And I think that the thing for me that really pops up when you get the governance right is that if you've got a rule book that you can fall to when there's a stressful situation, then you're less likely to make these, challenging errors. And I think one that hopefully organisations in Australia are starting to plan for now is how do we manage, say, the tropical cyclone risk or the bushfire risks that are coming up in an age of COVID, in an age of pandemic? Which laws are more important, or and so I think it's going to be really, really complex to unpack those.
In some ways here, like we've got the Climate Change Response Act, we had amendments made to that around, a little bit about some guidance to decision makers when those amendments came in last year. But we will see over the next term of government, depending on who's government, but the next term of government, expect that there'll be further amendments and further regulation and further legislative changes coming through, particularly around our Resource Management Act, where there's been a substantial review carried out on that, and some proposals for some really significant changes to that. But we will start seeing, hopefully we'll get more clarification over who has to make decisions. But with that will come compliance and enforcement provisions as well. So there'll be sort of more onerous, the obligation on decision may become more onerous when it comes to climate change. We'll see.
And Mark, so just to follow on from that, this is coming from Chris responding to your question. So Chris was saying, so those different responsibilities suggest the need for a multi-agency risk management approach. And is there the provision for that in the Act or under the TCFD?
I guess we have to sort of look into what a multi-agency risk management approach really means when it comes to climate change. I think that there's still a lot of uncertainty that needs to be sort of understood before we look at what that multi-agency response may be. I assume by multi-agency we're talking at central government level. As we know, look, there's a couple of interesting things, and there's an attempt already at government to ensure that climate change considerations are being made across all agencies in central government. There's a climate impact policy assessment where certain decisions that are going to cabinet have to be reviewed against the extent to which they're going to exacerbate climate change impacts. So that's already in place, and that was, it's sort of started off on it's sort of got a limited application at the moment, but it'll increase over time. So across agencies, but as we know with climate change, it's not something like that we were dealt with traditionally, where we just put it off in one team off to the side and they deal with it. Like across all organisations and all agencies, all entities really throughout the organisations need to be considering and dealing with climate change. And that's one of the things that I think organisations, and I certainly know our clients, tend to wrestle with is, how do we, can't we just put this in a box somewhere and say, climate change team, you'd manage that climate change risk team? But it's not. Like, it's every decision maker across the organisation's got to manage it. And the challenge to organisations is to ensure that that actually happens. And again, it comes back to your policy. It's not about saying, we'll set up a team to deal with risk. It's about every decision maker needs to understand and what the extent of climate change risk as it applies to that decision. And in some cases, it'll be significant, some not relevant or relevant, and then you've got to make an assessment of the materiality of that risk. But every decision maker across the organisation has to be involved in that.
Yeah, and in climate change speak, we call that mainstreaming. And essentially it's all about embedding climate risk deeply within the organisation. I mean, generally within your enterprise risk management process, for example, so that it just sort of flows naturally throughout the whole organisation.
It's interesting with that multi-agency or multi-stakeholder question though, because one of my clients, they called it adaptation standoff, and they were talking to me recently about the need for a new road to be done because of the ongoing coastal erosion. Now, they didn't want to pay for that road because they knew underneath that road, Telstra had some infrastructure underneath, and they were hoping that Telstra would pay for the seawall first before then and then as soon as Telstra said they needed to, dig up the road to fix the infrastructure, then they could get Telstra to pay for the seawall rather than doing it for themselves. And we're starting to see these really interesting sort of competing interests on who pays. So people are becoming aware of it, and they're starting to get quite strategic about it. I don't think it's,
But that's caused a lot of the litigation in Australia, and a little bit here, is where like private residents, property owners are seeing that government is not putting in infrastructure to protect their property, so they're doing it on their own initiative, or they're taking action against local government to do that. So you're right, there that standoff begins to.
Which once again brings up that legal issue again, and I think we'll get to most of these questions that we've got so far, but I think this is a relevant issue to raise to make sure that your adaptation itself isn't a fix. So a good example is there was community pressure to build a seawall up far north Queensland, and so what they did is they built a seawall, but they built it quickly, and some would argue they didn't build it to standard, and there was an 8-year-old boy that was playing around on the rocks, and one of the big rocks came down and killed him. And so the litigation for the council was that they had done this, these adaptation actions, and whilst when it was first built, it was structurally sound, but what people forget with some seawalls is that they're designed to fail as a big storm surge comes, and so then you have to go and monitor that, the rock wall, and make sure that it's fit for purpose. But people
that comes back to the point that we talk about physical risk and then we talk about our transition risk, and we kind of think that physical risk is something just happens now and today, but those physical impacts are in transition as well. But we have to look at all this, and everything is very, very fluid here, even those physical impacts. And you can't, decisions you make now about something like a seawall, you can't just build it to today's specifications. Like, you have to be looking forward. You have to do your scenario analysis. I mean, it seems obvious, but in practice, it's not happening.
And if you are building it to today's standards, you need to take into consideration, okay, how much is it going to cost me to enhance that as new knowledge comes to the fore? So you're starting to sort of take almost like pathway approaches, where you're doing a little bit based on what you know, but ensuring that you've got the option to enhance later on at minimum cost and minimum disruption. That's exactly right.
They call that the real option.
We've had this discussion before about the pathway approach. You can't use that pathway approach as simply a means to defer decisions. Like in many cases, you make the decision now, and the pathway may tell you give you an indication of where those points are when you have to revisit this decision. But the risk I've seen, and Donovan, you've seen it a lot in Australia, is where you put in these sort of adaptive pathway, have an approach, and then councils or organisations go, oh, we don't have to make that decision until 2020 or whatever. That's sort of a misapplication, I think, of that.
That's exactly right. So
cool.
At the end of the day, it's supposed to be dynamic, but once people have written on their x-axis, what their triggers are and what their responses are, they don't do anything. You're absolutely right. They kind of put it to the back burner, and the complexity with climate change is that it just all comes, from a multi sort of, facets and multi-directional and multi time scales as well. So it's pretty complex issue. Speaking of complexity, and maybe Mark, you can help clarify the question, and then maybe we could put it over to Ian. But it was one of the questions that was emailed to us, and it was somebody asked the question: what information would be expected from the MFE surveys around? There were questions associated with risks to social cohesion and community well-being, and risks of exacerbating inequities. Now, I imagine these were like set questions somewhere, Mark, that were from somewhere.
Yeah, that's one of the draft questions that MFE has circulated to some organisation to sort of test out and get feedback on what would be the most appropriate questions to be asking this first time around with those questions. But really, yeah, I agree. Something. Ian, you've done work in this area, so hand over to you.
Oh, I mean, there's a number of ways I can interpret this question. I mean, it comes back to what we were talking about before, though. It's contextual with respect to how you're going to respond to it. I guess what I could say is how I would go about coming up with an answer or digging into the issue. So I mean, certainly, climate change, and that's one of the big concerns around climate change is the capacity to impact those who have least available resources to cope with it in disproportionate ways, and that applies also to a transition. So certainly something that's been missing from the political debate in Australia is not so much about how do we actually move to a net zero carbon economy, but how do we do it in a just fashion. So that's starting to pop up at the moment. And I can give you an example about that. Like if you look at something like an organisation like Bank Australia, which is considered the most proactive climate change financial institution in Australia. Bank Australia actually started off as a credit union in the Hunter Valley, which is deep coal country. And they've made it very clear to their members, quite a significant number, which still are employed in the coal sector, that they are not supporting that particular sector anymore. But what they're doing is, they understand it's going to have an impact on employment. So what they're doing is they're starting to look at strategies where they can bolster employment in the Hunter in other ways. So, for example, they're bringing in their call centres into the Hunter and things like that. Now, I know I've gone off on a bit of a tangent here, but what I guess I'm saying is, this whole sort of social justice, social cohesion is something that needs to be considered, with whatever approaches you're taking to mitigate your risk. It needs to be done in a socially cohesive and justice orientated fashion. Now, in respect to actually getting back to the question, I think the way that you would look at this, and we've certainly done this in North Queensland. Again, it seems to be everything's happening in North Queensland just because it's so prone to extreme weather events, is, you need to be considering the socio-economic demographics of the area, and you can certainly get a sense very, very quickly about just how vulnerable, regions are, based on, on things like age, mobility, job security, the sector that that people are working in, and then you can start to get an idea of, from a physical perspective and also from a transition perspective, what climate change actually means to those people in that area. And then once again, you know, with respect to how you answer that, I mean, it's a tough one because it's going to come down to a judgment call. It's materiality. But of course, if this is going to a central government, I would assume that, look, if you think it's an issue, then you have to raise that. But once again, getting back to justifying it, then you've got the information you need to, you know, to justify your response.
And in New Zealand, oh, sorry, Mark.
I was going to say the government's set up, and one of the first sort of bodies that it set up here, this current term of government, when it started looking at climate change, was to set up a just transition unit. And, you know, and part of its mandate is to do that, was to look right across and see how the actions and policies of government were going to be impacting on, you know, the different sort of members of society and communities, to ensure that that was being managed. And if you look at the legislation, the Climate Change Response Act, the Zero Carbon Act, the amendments that it made, and you look at the criteria that the Minister and the Climate Change Commission have to take into account. You know, there was an effort made there to take into to consider, you know, to ensure that those considerations were being acknowledged and recognised and impact on communities. But just one other thing that we're doing, like, because I think it's an important part of the work we're doing, is we've set up a specific unit in our climate change team to climate change on Māori and the iwi, and we've been sort of running through the legislation and trying to develop an appreciation of where, you know, how those sort of the legal implications for Māori and iwi, but also looking at what are those obligations from, you know, facing, you know, public organisations with a public function, what obligations they owe to Māori and iwi under climate change. You know, and it's revealing some really interesting stuff. We're still, you know, I'm still not ready to sort of bring this out publicly, but it's something that's really an interesting part of the work that we're doing on that area.
That's fascinating, Mark. And one of the things that I've seen doing a bit of research around New Zealand is that you've got the environmental health indicators for social, so from EHINZ, for social vulnerability, and you can go online and actually look at the sort of differing. There's an example for flood hazard indicators for social vulnerability, and also one for natural hazards and pandemic. And I think there's a couple of things when you're looking at social vulnerability indicators, whilst they're really useful, especially when you're looking at current risks, just remember when you're looking out to the future, it gets a bit more complex. So a good example is if we had a location called West End on the outskirts of Brisbane. It's a bit of a sort of a hipster, you know, maybe a bit like a Ponsonby of Auckland type thing, where it started off being quite a low socioeconomic demographic. And so if you put those social economic indicators over it, say 20 or 30 years ago, that would have triggered, and the, you know, alarm bells would be going. If there was an extreme event that happened there, this would be an issue. However, as time moves, so does social vulnerability. And so in this area of West End, if you know, where the average house price might have been $300,000, you know, 10 or 12 years ago, and it'd be over $1 million now. And so if you put those indicators over with a climate risk now, they're actually probably some of the most resilient people in the community. So when you're forecasting future risks, you have to be a little bit careful about future vulnerability. So those vulnerability indicators are really critical for understanding in the short term, so your current and your short-term issues. It also gives you the ability to focus on adaptive capacity. So what things do you need to do for that area to kind of lift up the resilience of that community? But yeah,
it's a really good point, because that's often a failure of vulnerability assessments. Is that the vulnerability is considered as it stands, or considered in the context of the characteristics of a community now. And of course, I mean, to an extent, that can also sort of fold into, if you're doing any sort of scenario analysis and things like that. Scenario analysis doesn't have to be pulled out of the air. You know, it also needs to be grounded in reasonable assumptions. And certainly, you know, you would think that it should be possible to have a pretty good idea of, you know, what the characteristics of the community are going to be in 20, 30 years. You know, is it going to be more aged? so on and so forth. And then you can basically apply those comparisons and make some calls around, what the risks are to various peoples, which then of course do flow onto things like, social cohesion.
There's a really good example of that. It's an absurd example of development that went up in the Gold Coast, and it was in a area that is prone to inundation, sea level rise. You guys know this, but the development was built, and because of the regulation and that around it, the appeal was lodged against developing it, but it went to court, and the court had no choice but to allow the development to go ahead because of it met the necessary planning criteria. But the court then decided that a condition of the approval should be that there are lifeboats in the basement of the building, so that they could evacuate citizens, the tenants, if it was flooded. And that was sort of absurd, but that was a failing in the regulation because the courts really had no choice but to go there. But looking forward, that's a new building now and will have young families in it, but in 30 or 40 years time, there's likely to be more aged people in there or retirees, and getting them down and into a boat and moving out, like it becomes that no consideration giving to the difficulty of that. But just another thing is, in New Zealand, when they were deciding the COVID recovery package, a couple of the criteria against the proposed development were the New Zealand's 4 well-beings. We've got a well-being budget that was proposed. So, and also the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So those sort of considerations it was good that those were built into decisions around our COVID recovery infrastructure.
And I mean, and it just dawns on me also, and I should have thought of this before because I'm doing a big job with the infrastructure sector at the moment, but also the role of infrastructure service provision to communities. So if you are thinking about risk to social cohesion and community, you really need to be considering, okay, what's the capacity and what are the sort of services that are going to be demanded, in a climate infused world. And that has big impacts right now, as we were talking before, with the like the real options approaches and all that sort of stuff, or no regrets or whatever around, enabling or decision makers making decisions right now about infrastructure that potentially is going to be around for 50, 80, 100, even more. And not only the infrastructure itself, but the path dependencies that infrastructure can create. Whereby, you might be opening up a road, for example, which then enables development at the end of the road. But if that development's in a like as you were saying, Mark, in a swamp or something like that, then essentially you're potentially setting up a community which is doomed to fail.
And that's one of the big concerns. Oh, that's really one of the big. That's what we were talking about a lot when we were planning or doing scenario analysis. Is that like New Zealand's got a 2050 target, and we've got a lot of certainty around what we're going to look like in 2050. We know what our emissions levels are, so we can work out what our budgets are going to be. We can get a fairly good idea almost on what our carbon prices are going to be and how our funders, public and private sector financiers are going to be responding in respect of those, the impacts from those carbon prices. So we've got a pretty good idea in many ways of what 2050 is going to look like. So what organisations like local authorities need to be doing is looking at 2050 and saying, what sort of community, what's my local government area going to look like, given those certainties in 2050? What can function there? What's going to thrive? What's not going to thrive? I can envisage that and plan and understand that, and now start planning for that. And that comes down to like, who in my community is going to need assistance, or who's, which businesses are going to be able to take advantage of these opportunities that are coming up, and then provide that support now going forward to that day.
And the critical thing so I absolutely agree with you, Mark. And then if you have identified the elements that will are critical, for the future, for that community, then you also might decide that has a higher design spec. So, for example, you might have a 1% flood risk or a 0.5% flood risk for residential properties. But if you're wanting to build a hospital or a aged care facility, then that, because it's going to be, increased aging population, then you would say, okay, well, actually, this has to be designed to a higher standard. And in Australia, we saw failings once again in that space where we had the Coffs Harbour Hospital was built, 10 or 15 years ago as a brand new hospital, and it's flooded 3 times so far. And to the point where the hospital was high enough, but the car park was underwater and the ambulances couldn't get to the hospital, and so there was a disconnect in the thinking, and obviously, regulatory failures in that space. So let's just tease out some more questions that have come through via the email. So one of the questions, this is to you, Mark, would be the questions around the information that people disclose, that organisations disclose. So what happens to the information once they've disclosed it? So will it be shared? Will it be shared broadly to the public? And will those results also be communicated back into the sector and aggregated? Do you know much about that?
Well, we know the information is going to be used to inform the National Adaptation Plan. So I'm not really sure if sharing is the right word, because there are controls in the legislation around the confidentiality of the information that's going to be put forward. But that information will absolutely affect decisions, certainly at central government level and beyond. And it's going to affect the outcome of the National Adaptation Plan, and that may result in changes to regulation or an allocation of resources. So the information will go into government, and it'll be I guess there'll be some level of sharing in that between agencies or within that. But it's really what's really important is what the outcomes from that information will be, and that, as I said, that's going to appear in the National Adaptation Plan.
And those sensitivities around sharing of risk information, and I'll ask Ian to make a comment actually on this as well. But it's very sensitive here in Australia too. So we'll get some jurisdictions, some local governments say, well, of course we're going to share the information. The community are our shareholders, and so we always publicly disclose our climate-related risks. And often we see that occurring in, especially around South Australia, where it's kind of like it's just like the norm. Why wouldn't you be sharing this information? But we do get councils, and state agencies, who don't want to share that information. And sometimes they're nervous because of some potential political risk. And in Australia, we have that political risk. And I think sometimes it also comes down to the complexity of the issue. And elected members often don't like, it's a bit of a generalization, but it's very hard as an elected member to commit to a key performance indicator that includes systems change, as a response to this really complex issue. Ian, I don't know if you want to make a comment about risk transparency.
Oh God, mate, I don't know where to start. I think it highlights a few things. One is the political risk, and it highlights the importance of taking your community with you as you embark on this journey. It's the old adage, the politicians will do what the people tell them to do. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's easier said than done. But the earlier you start your stakeholder engagement, the greater chance you've got of maximising, that stakeholder support. To me, I mean, it's a bit of a more of a legal question. I could always bounce this one back to Mark, but certainly there are case studies in Australia. I mean, if you look at Lake Macquarie, for example, which started to issue, I think, with some sort of permit or classification around exposure to storm tide inundation and coastal hazards to some of their property owners. And of course, the property owners were up in arms because it was an immediate impact on the valuation of their property, and it also had implications for what improvements they could apply to their property and things like that. And my understanding is that was overturned. So, and I'm not 100% clear. And as I say, I'll defer this one back to you, Mark, around the legal sort of support, if you like, within New Zealand that actually enables councils to appropriately disclose their risk. But in the absence of that, which, to be honest, we've had in Australia and especially in Queensland, it can make the decision for councils very, very difficult.
There was actually a very similar case. I know both cases, but we had a similar case here with the Kapiti Coast District Council in New Zealand, where it put information on the land information memorandums on the LINs, and that was challenged and it went to court. And unfortunately, that decision made a lot of councils shy about putting information, concerned about releasing information because they were concerned about, litigation. But what really that decision said was that you've got to, rightly, you should put this sort of information for these sort of global phenomena. They should be made available, and it was appropriate on a limb to put that information on there. But more importantly, that information has to be accurate, and it should be comprehensive and complete, which is and I talked about this in the session, so I won't go back there, but this is exactly what this disclosure regime is all about, ensuring that, complete, comprehensive and accurate information is being provided to stakeholders so that they can make the appropriate decision. Now, in this case, the stakeholder really is central government because it's using it for the purpose of the National Adaptation Plan. And when we're looking at the proposed mandatory reporting regime for financial institutions here in New Zealand, the stakeholders are really, the investors and the, and other entities that sort of have general an interest in that corporation, but to make sure that they're getting accurate information so that they can make their decisions and understand the risks that those organisations are being faced with. And then internally, you need that information so that you ensure you are as an organisation making those decisions accurately. But just sort of going back to the point about sharing information and how useful it is, and I'm going to put that back to you, Donovan, because this is exactly what you've been doing with the 300 odd councils that you're working with in Australia, where you explain a bit of me, but you're putting information, you're gathering it, you're aggregating that information, and you're anonymizing it, but you're providing those outcomes, those findings to organisations, other organisations, and what you've seen in Australia. Because of that, you're creating benchmarks, and it's causing really positive responses to occur. It's like there's that informal assurance mechanism I sort of talked about before, is that by sharing that information, you just make everyone perform better.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, yes, we did do that. So when we were measuring governance, climate change governance, so to what extent is an organisation mainstreaming its activities, and we did it for about 300, or have done it and continue to do it for about 350 local governments here in Australia. And for some agencies, so it's actually being used by some agencies to take the collective results to reinsurers, but also to foster that community of practice. And for me, that was actually one of the most important parts. And so if somebody had scored really high on an asset management plan or a financial management plan, they're the sort of the two big gaps that we usually find in Australian governance around climate change risk. What they could do is then share those results, because municipalities are really good at sharing information with each other, but they just have to find that information. And so we've run a few sort of peer-to-peer, groupings or workshops where the organisation who had scored really high in one of the indicator scores then shares that with the wider community. There's a question here that is regarding the sharing of information. So I think this is definitely transitions, and I think is probably I'm going to ask Ian this, because I think Ian's I think a guru in the insurance space, and this is how I met Ian. Actually, I was when he was doing his thesis on insurance risk for municipalities. So the question is, as a council, we're happy to share our information, but insurance companies all seem to regard their hazard information as commercially sensitive, and some will insure an area where others won't, which leads us to wonder, what they know that we don't, which is a really interesting question, and it probably can be flipped both ways actually. Is there a mechanism to allow access to that information? So maybe Ian, if you could just touch on some of the stuff that's happening, because we have seen that happen here, and there are places in Australia that are uninsurable, or sometimes the insurer might say it's not uninsurable, you just have to pay 90% of the value of your property each year or something. Is that right, Ian?
Yeah, no, that's right. And there's been numerous inquiries into why that's the case, and various solutions proposed. But it all comes back to risk management, being able to display that risks are being managed appropriately to a point that can enable insurers to provide essentially affordable insurance. Because, I mean, when we talk about access to insurance, we're just talking about affordability. It gets to a point where premiums become too expensive, whereby it's just not commercial, it doesn't make sense, or quite frankly, people just can't afford to take out that coverage. With the hazard map question, I mean, I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. I know that the Insurance Council of Australia and various insurance orientated associations in this country, where insurance is being looked at, once again in places like North Australia, for example, where insurance premiums, and I think I mentioned it in the presentation, have increased significantly. One of the things that the insurers are often requesting is hazard maps from councils, on the justification that if they've got that granularity, based on those maps, that then they can be more detailed and specific around their insurance policies. You know, the old chestnut of the house up on the hill paying the same flood insurance as the house at the bottom of the hill. So they're often looking for those sorts of tool sets that enable them to make that distinction. I mean, that's the theory.
And if we bring that back to New Zealand, and because I imagine that, you know, it's more about the way insurance companies work. So insurers don't look at that 30 and 50 year sort of time frame for their pricing. You know, it's an annual, or at least if you're lucky, it might be a 2-yearly stretch where they're looking at their pricing mechanism. So I think, Nikki, you know, if I look at your question and you say, if there's locations that insurers are not insuring in New Zealand, it will be because of the historical and calculated risk from the actuaries at present, right, Ian?
That's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, you know, insurance, and it's a bit of a tension when it comes to climate change. Is you know, insurance or premiums or policies are rewritten, you know, generally annually. So insurers can then adjust their premiums to reflect any change in risk, you know, on that annual basis. And certainly, traditionally, the way that insurance is calculated, it's based on what's called stochastic modelling, which is very much backward looking and based on historical metrics. So that's exactly right.
And I think that just in terms, just before I move on to the next question, I think it's worthwhile noting that then that insurance component, that it presents the risks to the council and the community they look after, and also is their rateable income stream. In Australia, we had actually insure. It was a really public example where they said, we're no longer going to insure this town until somebody builds a levee around the town, you know, and that pressure from the insurer actually resulted in a physical levee being built around the town to reduce the flood risk.
But sorry, Don, I think, because I might have given the wrong impression now talking about the historical backward-looking generation of risk. I mean, that's not it. That's not totally it either, of course, right? You know, climate risk and these extreme weather events are issues certainly over here right now. You know. Totally. And so it has to be forward-looking. It has to be projection-based to an extent. So even though they are pricing the risk right now, and it is based to an extent on historical, I mean, the historical is more about actually, that's the information that goes into the projections per se, and that's a bit of a failing at the moment around projection approaches that is being looked at and addressed and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it is very much forward-looking.
And I think people need to also realise that even if you look at historical and you look at the last 30 years, you look at New Zealand has already experienced almost a degree of warming. So we are in climate change, you know, so
that's exactly right.
A degree of warming's already come. In the summers are much hotter, the droughts are manifesting, the extreme weathers are, you know, much more extreme. You know,
sorry, just adding on to that, the point that you raised, Ian, is that why are we doing this disclosure exercise is for us to understand that risk, and the benefit. One of the great benefits of understanding that risk is we can we can quantify it or we can cost it, and that affects financial decisions, and it affects those insurance decisions. So it's really important that we the better the disclosure, the better we can understand that risk, the better we can cost it. And if you haven't got it by now, you need to understand that climate change is all about financial risk. Like that's a really important part of it. You know, the physical impacts, of course, is what we're dealing with, but you need to look going forward at the financial risk, because those where the pressures are going to start coming on organisations. When I'm saying before looking at 2050, you know, how are you going to fund that 2050 community? Because you've got your financial, the providers of funding in that will be taking into account those risks, and they want to quantify it, and they want to understand it and accurately cost it.
And that's sorry, Don, that's an important point. You know, insurance is critical. There's no doubt about that. Insurance provides the confidence. It enables cash flows that allow, you know, businesses and organisations to undertake their activities with confidence. It's an important element of economies and the way that we operate. But when you're in the climate space and looking at finance, my biggest concern is not insurance. It's actually access to finance. It's access to debt. It's access to long-dated debt. Because then the timeframes are much more aligned, you know, but by the same token, you know, if you're dealing with climate risk, you're dealing with insurance because you are reducing your risk, and you need to be able to show that to the insurer. At the same time, you're also dealing with climate risk, which you're able to actually display to your financier also. So it's just co-benefits all around.
And coming back from that, I guess the quantification around insurance and quantification around finance comes to one of the, I think we've probably got time for one more question. One of the questions that got emailed was around, what are the metrics? What sorts of things should we be actually tracking? And my short answer to that would be probably a little bit of everything. And you know, it's anything that's relevant, but I'd say at least track the information that you need to know now. So it might be around issues around insurance, and it might be issues around, you know, your access to finance. But you'd also definitely should be tracking anything associated with your key performance indicators. So if your key performance indicator is carbon, then of course you need to be, you know, if you're going to go net zero by a certain date, then you need to be tracking that. But also start thinking about the types of metrics that a third party might be asking of you. So you've got metrics that you need to understand as an organisation for what you think you're pressing issues now for your own resilience and low carbon future. Then you've got the metrics that you might be asked of from MFE. And then you've also got these metrics from the third party. So it might be an insurer, it might be a credit rating agency, it might be the public, you know. And so my short answer to that, in terms of, you know, grouping the types of information, align it to things like the TCFD, look at your scenarios, I think track climate. So look at your historical data, show how that's been changing over time. This is what we do with that climate monitor tool, you know, so you can track your climate data over time, because, you know, climate projections seem to be getting worse and worse every time we look at them. So always make sure you've got the ability to do the navel gazing in that space. And I think you should be, as a metric, measure it, because you can measure your governance. So track your governance, measure that to see how you're going, and are you improving? And if you're not, why not? Exposure is really critical. So track your exposure, you know, number of your own assets or your community assets or the natural environment assets. Vulnerability, we spoke about a range of vulnerability indicators, and start feeding those in, you know, onto your decision platform. Track regulations, track legal precedents, and those things are going to be really critical things that stroke of the pen risk sort of often happen overnight. You could be tracking your activities to manage the risk, your financial ramifications, but also start tracking the market indicators, you know, insurance availability, mortgage availability. And so, you know, there's a complex array of things to track, but you do actually need to start looking at it in that broader picture, because your approach cannot be a stagnant response. I'm interested in what the others think in about a minute and a half.
Yeah, just the metrics is such a big thing, and we found with any of the clients that we're dealing with, you know, you set up a policy, and you sort of put that framework in place, and then when you go to do the work, you go, well, metrics. You know, you realise this is a really important and fundamental part, and it's a really hard part of you know what we're doing. First of all, to understand what metrics you should be using and how you're applying them, and then this comes back to my earlier point about, you know, we've got to make sure that there's consistency and comparability across disclosure. There's a, you know, if you're setting up a consultancy, you know, get into metrics. You know, this is good opportunity. But, you know, there's got to have to be a lot of guidance, and, you know, and Treasury, the Reserve Bank has come out and spoken about guidance around disclosure and that. But there'll be a lot more in this space, I think.
Yeah, and I think you need to crawl before you walk, and a good place to start is actually is at the governance layer. Metrics that basically support that. The governance is being applied and risk management is being applied. I mean, that could be number of employees engaged and educated around climate risk and what it means for their job. Things simple as that.
We're going to have to close up, guys, because we're right on the time. So thanks for everyone for attending. Thanks Donovan and thanks Chloe behind the scenes for doing this. Didn't get to all your questions, but really appreciate the things you asked. There's some really good things that came out, good questions that were raised. If you have any other queries, please feel free to contact any of us. I think our emails were in the invitation. But again, thank you very much and ka kite.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.